This tutorial video will show you how to sew a basic plain seam with a sewing machine. We're going to look at this fabric and notice that it has a right side and a wrong side. The right side is the more colorful side. To get started with this plain seam, we're going to put the right sides of the fabric together. Once we have the right sides of the fabric together, we'll lift a presser foot on the sewing machine and place the fabric underneath. And we'll place it at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. That's between the 1/2 inch mark and the 3/4 inch mark. Then we'll sew a bit, reverse, and backstitch to hold our stitching in place. Then we'll sew straight along at 5/8 inch distance from the edge of the fabric, all the way to the bottom where we'll stop, and then once again we'll backstitch about 5 stitches to secure the stitching in place. Then make sure the needle is all the way up, and then we can raise the presser foot and pull the fabric away, trimming the threads close. We need to press this open so it will lay flat. As you can see here, we can see the right sides of the fabric in the middle. This seam is unfinished, but it still looks really nice from the other side. Now that we're at the ironing board, we can open up this seam and press it open. You can press it to the side if you want, but usually it's pressed open like this. Grab your iron and then press it down, applying heat and pressure as needed. This helps to remove bulk and have the fabric lay flat. Now remember, this seam has unfinished edges, so it can unravel, but it still looks really nice from this side. There are other ways that you can finish seams, but this would work if there's a lining on the garment or you're using fabric that doesn't fray too much. So it's a nice, simple, and quick seam to put things together. Happy sewing! In this sewing tutorial, we're going to learn how to sew a French seam. This is a great seam that finishes all the raw edges of the fabric. To start this seam, we're going to go ahead and place the wrong sides of the fabric together. This is different than the plain seam where the right sides of the fabric are together. Then we're going to stitch a 3/8 inch seam allowance. That's between the 1/4 mark and the 1/2 inch mark. We'll stitch a little bit, and then we'll press the reverse lever and backstitch. Then we'll continue stitching down at 3/8 of an inch. If you adjust your pattern, you can stitch at 1/4 of an inch, but that can be difficult on some fabrics. So here we're stitching at 3/8 of an inch. Then at the end, backstitch, raise your needle, and then pull your fabric away and trim the excess thread. Now what we need to do is trim close to the edge of our stitching. So we'll trim 1/4 inch away from the stitching. Use your scissors and cut in a straight line 1/4 inch away from the stitching and discard the excess fabric. Then we'll wrap this around so we can see the wrong sides. We'll press this down flat. Now that we have it folded under and we can feel the edge of the seam, we'll go ahead and place it under the presser foot. You can see here that this will encase the raw edges of the fabric. Feel with your finger and then make sure your needle is to one side of that. It should be approximately 3/8 of an inch. Go ahead and begin stitching. Stitch a little bit, then reverse to backstitch to lock the stitching in place. And then make sure that you go as close as possible to those cut edges. Stay straight, but don't let any of them go past your stitching, otherwise it will be revealed on the right side of the fabric. Trim your thread, and now when we fold this open, we can see we have a nice finished seam on this side, and then all of the raw edges of the fabric are encased and they won't unravel. This is a great seam finish and is very simple to do, although it is difficult to do on curves. Once you're done, you can go ahead and press it to one side with an iron. Here I'm pressing it over to the right. Use heat and pressure settings that are appropriate for the fabric you're using, and now you know how to sew a French seam with your sewing machine. Happy sewing! In this sewing tutorial, we're going to learn how to sew a mock flat felled seam, which is slightly different than a true flat felled seam or lap seam. To get started, we'll go ahead and put the wrong sides of the fabric together. This is similar to setting up a French seam. You can tell the wrong sides of the fabric because they're usually discolored a bit. Once you have the wrong sides together, place the fabric under the presser foot, and we're going to stitch a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Go ahead and stitch straight down at 5/8 of an inch, and then when you get down to the bottom, go ahead and reverse and back tack a little bit to hold the stitching in place. Now we can trim our threads and get ready to prepare the mock flat felled seam. To make a mock flat felled seam, we need to trim one of these seam allowances. I generally trim the one on the bottom because it's easier, but it does depend on which way you actually want to fold the seam, so make sure you pay attention. Trim it in half to about a 1/4 inch or so, and try to be straight, and don't cut into any of the other parts of the fabric. Now we'll go ahead and lay the wrong sides of the fabric down, and then we're going to wrap the longer seam allowance around the other seam allowance that is now trimmed shorter, and this will encase it and keep it from fraying. You want to try to press this down and keep the width very equal and even so it looks nice and straight. Once you have this set, you can go ahead and put it under your presser foot, lining up right on the edge of that new folded seam. Stitch a bit, then back stitch, then take a second to make sure everything is nice and straight, and then continue top stitching to hold that mock flat felled seam in place. As you go all the way down, you can pause to readjust your fold to keep the width nice and consistent and looking sharp. You want to keep the stitching distance from each other even as well. Backstitch to keep everything in place. Go ahead and trim your threads. And now you have a mock flat felled seam. From the front, it looks like a normal flat felled seam, but on the back, you can tell that the stitching only goes through all the layers of fabric on one side. On a true flat felled seam, it would go all the way through. This is also called a lap seam, and you see it in jeans, and it takes a special machine to be able to do, particularly a double needle and double bobbin sewing machine. But this works really well too and can be used on shirts. Once you're done, you can go ahead and press this seam down with your iron, and it will make everything lay nice and flat. Now you know how to sew a mock flat felled seam. Happy sewing, everyone. In this sewing tutorial, we're going to learn how to use a serger to sew a seam and have the edges finished at the exact same time. For this seam, we're going to sew a basic straight seam with the right sides of the fabric together. Go ahead and put it under the presser foot. And then notice that there is a blade that's going to cut off, and we want to line the needle up to where we want our seam to be. Then we'll go ahead and start sewing. As we sew, you'll notice that the blade cuts the fabric. We want to be careful that we don't touch this and that we are sewing straight. Notice that this chain is sticking out. We want to leave some of the chain hanging off the actual fabric and some hanging off the serger. That way, the fabric and the stitching won't unravel. You can secure this if it's not going to be encapsulated in a hem or other stitching. Once we have this, we can go ahead and take it to the iron and press it open. One downside of sewing a seam this way is that there's no room for redoing it if it doesn't fit. So you want to make sure you're very accurate and you know where your seam should be. This can work very well on knit and stretchy fabrics. Sometimes on woven fabrics, it's better to stitch it first before sewing with the serger. But this gives you a nice clean seam, and now you know how to sew a basic straight seam with a serger. Happy sewing! In this sewing tutorial, I'm going to show you how to serge and then top stitch. Notice that this is already stitched together. This is common with woven fabrics and when you want more strength in your serged seam. Now I'm going to trim off the seam allowances with the serger, and this will also encapsulate the raw edges of the fabric. I'll sew straight along at my desired width for the finish. Once again, when using a serger, make sure you pull the chain far out and cut enough of the chain to stay on the fabric and some by the serger. Now, when we unfold this, notice that we have the original stitching, just like a plain seam, but now we have the serger finishing off the edges. Then we can go back to the regular sewing machine and we're going to stitch this down. This is a great finish for out seams on slacks or jeans. You can go ahead and top stitch right along and it will make this seam a little stronger and it'll also keep everything in place. Stitch a bit, then backstitch, then go straight down. It's important that you go straight along the edge. That way the stitching looks straight and is not wonky and wobbly. Backstitch, then lift your needle and trim any excess threads. Now you have a nice stylish seam that is encapsulated on the inside with the overlocking serger, and then you can go ahead and press it down on the ironing board. It's mostly pressed down now, but just adding a little press to it will keep everything in place. Now you know how to sew a serge seam with top stitching. Happy sewing! In this sewing tutorial, we're going to learn about a busted seam. This is a very common seam in jeans, and to get started, we'll take our fabric and sew right along the edge, barely trimming off a hair's width with our serger to keep the ends of the fabric from fraying. As you can see here, I'm just barely taking off a bit of the fabric, and then the fabric end is all encapsulated with the overlock serging stitch, and it will not unravel. Make sure when you trim, you have some of that chain hanging off the machine and your fabric so the stitching doesn't come undone. Then I'll go ahead and do this for the other side. Once again, lining up the edge of the fabric just along the blade of the serger. That way we don't take off too much of the seam allowance to change the dimensions of our pattern and the fit of what we are sewing. Once you finish the seam, pull it through, make a long chain, leave some length on both the machine and the fabric to keep things from unraveling. Now we're ready to go to our regular sewing machine and make our busted seam. At the regular sewing machine, we'll place this right sides of the fabric together, lining up the serged edges of the fabric. These should be very straight because they were just trimmed. Then we'll go ahead and sew a standard 5/8 inch seam allowance. Line up our needle, we'll stitch a bit, and then we will batch stitch. Then sew straight along 5/8 of an inch all the way down to the bottom, and then we will stop at the end and backstitch to secure the stitching. Raise your needle, then remove the fabric and trim all excess threads. When we unfold the fabric, you can see it looks like a standard straight seam on one side, but now we have these pre-serged edges that are separate, and then we can go to the ironing board and we can press these open. Here I am pressing it open with the iron. This is the busting of the seam, busting it open. And once that's done, it'll look nice and straight on one side and flat, just like a pair of pants. And then on the inside, if you take a look at many of your ready-to-wear jeans, you'll see this exact finish. And then we can go ahead and hem the bottom if we want. We'll press this with the iron as well after we folded this up twice. And this will take care of those extra serger threads at the bottom. That way they won't unravel because they're encapsulated inside this folded hem. So press it down with the iron. This will make sewing it much easier because everything will stay in place. Take your time and make everything be straight. Once it's pressed down, then we can take it back to our sewing machine and go ahead and stitch this hem down. There are many ways to hem or finish the edge of fabric. This is just a simple fold it over twice way and then stitching along the edge. When we go past the busted seam, this is encapsulating everything and nothing will unravel, and you have a fully finished piece of fabric and a seam that lays very flat on the inside. Here we are, a busted seam, and now you can sew one yourself. Happy sewing, everyone.